Hello everyone. In this video we'll talk about men and emotions, strength, weakness, and the concept of chivalry as discussed by C.S. Lewis. So I'm going to read from an essay of his that's highly relevant to some of the things that we'll get into in this video. But overall we're looking at the relationship that men ought to ideally have with their emotions. Do emotions just merely entail weakness? Does it make us unnecessarily vulnerable? Do they merely overwhelm? Is there something incompatible with masculinity itself to indulge in emotions? Conversely, some might say, well, is it our tendency to avoid, distract from, or deny our feelings that somehow, gets us into trouble? Does it lead to, problems in our relationships? Does it lead to behaviors that some might describe as toxic, or impulsive, lashing out at people and so on and so forth? Now, my answer to some of those questions or concerns is that, well, it's kind of complicated. It's context matters, and it also involves, the degree to which there's some flexibility within, the individual person, within a man. So we can think of situations, for example, so on the side of, do emotions make us weak? Sometimes it does. Sometimes they do. So if we can think of if you're serving in the military, if you're a first responder, if you're in law enforcement, or if you're in a historical period or a place where there's a high probability, or there's a chance rather, that you might need to deal with some horrific circumstances. You might need to defend yourself. You might need to fight to defend your family, your community, or even your country. And in those circumstances or situations, decisive action is crucial. And if you're overwhelmed by emotions, incapacitated by fear, anxiety, or feelings of sadness and loss and so on, you're just not able to do what you need to be able to do in those circumstances. And throughout all of history, men have been, the defenders of a community, a civilization, society, and so on. So there is an important role that men historically play in that way, to be able to act decisively, to rise to the occasion, to do what needs to be done, even in horrific circumstances. And emotions, arguably, are a hindrance to us in those situations, if they overwhelm or overpower us to the point where we can't act. You could, I suppose, make an argument that certain kinds of feelings, energies, whether it's pride or honor or reverence or anger kind of directed in the right way, that they could be beneficial or helpful. But I'll leave that aside for now. Now, the problem, though, is that if this is applied as a general rule, that men in general and as a whole should develop themselves in such a way that they minimize or deny or distract from their innermost feelings, that they concern themselves with just practicalities and logic and reason and so on. This is where it becomes, I think, a problem, because we are still human. We still feel things. So, especially those vulnerable feelings that we might have, feelings of sadness, loss, disappointment, and so on. Like, these energies, they have to go somewhere. On a physiological level, emotion is electrical chemical energy. It has to go somewhere in the body, and more often than not, it manifests as excess stress or tension, anxiety that you're carrying in your body. And ironically, the idea is that, suppression of emotion is supposed to make us strong. Ironically, if you do that as a habit, as an overall general disposition or way of being, it kind of makes you fragile. It kind of makes you, because you're inflexible, you don't have the ability to choose to be strong and resolute and action-oriented, or to take a moment to acknowledge your feelings, to be vulnerable in the presence of the people closest to you, the people who have the right, the privilege of knowing you in that way. And that's an important part of, psychological intimacy and our significant relationships. So if we're cut off from that, again, it makes us prone to stress, anxiety, and tension that we may be coping with in unhealthy ways through marijuana use, alcohol abuse, various addictions. And it hurts potentially our relationships as well, as we're not able to be vulnerable in those moments where we need to. And because we can't be vulnerable, it maybe makes us hard to be as compassionate toward others as we could be, or to have empathy and that felt concern for others. So this can create problems. So a way of thinking about this, or another way of thinking about it, is through the lens of emotion regulation. So it has to do with our ability to tolerate certain kinds of emotions, to be able to hold space for those emotional energies, to hang out in those feelings without being overwhelmed, on the one hand, and without having to detach from some part of the experience or compartmentalize or avoid engaging with those relevant feelings. So the idea is that we're able to be in that feeling, and the feeling doesn't possess us, it doesn't overpower us. We're in it, we're aware of it, we can sense it, we can feel it, but we're still very much in the driver's seat, so to speak. And a metaphor that I like to use, particularly with men, is a weightlifting metaphor. So if you imagine going to the gym for the first time, you've never been to a gym before, and you step into a squat rack and you try to lift 250, 300 pounds off that rack. If you've never done that before, assuming you can get it off the rack at all, you're going to be swaying back and forth, you're going to be shaky, unsteady, you're going to be wobbling all over the place. If you hadn't put collars on the end of the bar, the plates are going to slide off, they're going to hit the person next to you, they're going to drop and fall and perhaps injure you. You're going to throw your back out. It's just going to be a mess. And this is the equivalent of dysregulated emotion. And it's just chaos. It's just a mess. It's not restrained in any way. And an example of that is anger. If you can't regulate your anger, if you can't feel your anger and embody that energy without it getting away from you, you're going to be impulsive. You're going to be dysregulated. You're going to have rage fits. And the people that are often going to be targets are the people that you don't intend to be targets, and then you're going to feel guilty and ashamed afterward. It's just going to be a mess. It's not good. So think about it in terms of, again, the weightlifting metaphor. The way to work up to the 250, 300 pounds is to practice it, to start small. Just work with your body weight at first. Get accustomed to just that movement pattern. And then start with a bar, and then put a plate on either side and work from there. And before you know it, you just get so good at it that you're able to walk around the gym with the bar on your back if you wanted to, without fear that you're going to lose control, without fear that it's going to get away from you. And the same thing with emotions. The more you engage with them, the more you understand them, the more you embody that energy and put words to it, and you can hang out in those feelings for a time. The easier it gets, and this is something that you want to be able to do. You access both the vulnerable side of your way of being, those vulnerable feelings, sadness, disappointment, loss, grief, and so on, and also the assertive energies such as anger. So that's very, very important. Now, if we go back to masculinity here for a moment, and I think one of the things that's important to point out is that modern men, because increasingly there are people who are raising the alarm bells that modern men are losing their sense of masculinity. The masculinity is in crisis of sorts. Now other people are saying that masculinity is all bad, it's all toxic, it needs to be deconstructed, torn apart. The whole notion of men needs an overhaul, and so on and so forth. And this is part of the culture wars, right? So and men are kind of caught in this, and we're frequently, browbeaten, made to feel guilty for, historical issues and so on that had nothing to do with us necessarily as individuals. And the issue is that modern men are weak, literally. So grip strength has gone down increasingly since, I believe, the 80s. Testosterone has gone down, which is an important part of just the psychological well-being of men. Marriage and fertility rates are going down. So masculinity is in crisis. We're in crisis here. This is not a good thing at all. And again, we're browbeaten and made to feel guilty and bad, and we end up just hanging our heads in shame and this kind of thing. And it's just not good. It's not good at all. So we need to reclaim, that's part of what I'm attempting to do here in this video, I guess, make an argument that we need to reclaim a healthy form of masculinity, and I'm trying to spell out what that might look like. What we don't want to do is we don't want to either fall on the side of just being spineless bug men, where we're just easily manipulated, controlled, and made to feel guilty, and we're submissive and all the rest of it. No, we want to be men. And so that's important. And on the other side, we don't want to put on a caricature or a facade of masculinity, right? Where you're, I guess, trying to show off or be a braggart or dominate people or overpower people and feel good about yourself in that way, without any humility or modesty or anything like that. And this would be like the Andrew Tates of the world. And unfortunately, some people look up to these kinds of individuals as role models. They are not, and that is not the kind of masculinity that anyone wants to embody. That's not a good thing. That is not a healthy thing at all. And more often than not, these people, they do have insecurities that they feel like they have to go to this place with it. A truly masculine man is someone who feels confident and comfortable within himself. He doesn't have anything he needs to prove. He doesn't need to show himself up, to others or anything like that. It's not needed. The masculine man is not a braggart. He's quiet and reserved and modest at times. And anyway, we're going to get into some of that. But so I'm advocating a need for men to access and connect with the vulnerable side of their way of being, and also with that assertive side. So both sides is what I'm advocating here. And another metaphor that is might help you understand this, or what I'm trying to get at, and I don't know, I'm sure someone else must have come up with this. I don't know where I picked it up from, but the metaphor of going into our interpersonal relationships and just the way that we carry ourselves and walk around in the world, that we do so with open arms, open heart, and yet we have a shield on our back and a sword at our hip. Okay, so the open arms start of it, that's where there's a willingness to be vulnerable. There's no need to have one's guard up, and there's a trust within yourself that you are, just by existing, just by being out there in the world, interacting with people. It's a risky endeavor. There are going to be situations where people are going to talk down to you, people are going to dismiss you, people are going to disrespect you. But you're not walking around with a chip on your shoulder. You're not walking around with your back up or a guardedness or something like that. There's an internal trust that whatever that is, the hurt, the disappointment, whatever you're going to be wearing for a time, that you can handle it. That you have enough integrity, you have enough within yourself that you can shoulder those burdens, that you can survive those minor little psychological wounds and so on, right? So when I was growing up, we had this saying that many people have heard of this before, that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names may never hurt me. So the idea being that names aren't going to rattle you. They're not going to affect you. They may upset you briefly, but they're not going to overwhelm you to the point where you're needing to flee to safe spaces from hearing words that are going to upset you and so on. Or you're going to need trigger warnings to make sure that you're not going to be overwhelmed or upset about something. So there's a trust within yourself that just naturally when these things occur, like you can handle it, you can take it. And if things get bad enough, if someone is disrespectful toward you, if someone is trying to hurt you in some way, psychologically speaking, if there's profound disappointments or betrayals and so on, the shield comes off the back and you hold it steady, and you're not going to let anything else in. You're not going to let anything else, hurt you in a way that it threatens your constitution, your integrity. And then if things get bad enough, guess what? The sword comes off the hip. And I'm not talking about, physical violence or anything like that. It's a metaphor. What I mean is that you can access that assertive energy within yourself to plant your feet firmly, look someone square in the eyes, and calmly say, enough is enough. not putting up with this. And you mean it with absolute authority, okay? And conviction. And that's important. And so in our relationships, again, be vulnerable. Let your guard down. You know, if someone isn't able to read your mind, let them know. I feel hurt. I feel dismissed. I feel, you know, what have you. And that is taking a second risk, because the other person may be indifferent. The other person may not be moved by that in any way. But it takes a big person to be able to do that with, you know, the people who are perhaps deserving of that chance. And then things get bad enough, well, you can handle yourself. And I think that's what it ought to mean to be a man in a sense. Now, I want to make a brief comment about stoicism, because I think a lot of people think that, well, it's a man's lot to be stoic, and where they take stoicism to mean being unemotional, being dismissive toward feeling, and again, they're oriented only toward practicalities and logic and reason and so on. And I think this is, in my opinion, a gross misrepresentation, misreading of Stoicism. Stoicism does not mean that you're denying emotion or that you're not acknowledging feeling and so on and so forth. It's not advocating psychological repression, in other words. What it means is that, again, you can hang out in this energy, you acknowledge it, it's there, it's real, but you're not going to allow it to dominate you. You're not going to allow it to become the entirety of your being in that moment. Stoicism as well is the idea that we're going to focus on that which is within our control to change and alter. And if part of what we can't change is how we feel in that moment, we acknowledge it, but we have a kind of indifference toward it. That doesn't mean that we're not paying attention to it, we don't notice it. It means that we're not going to allow it to factor into our decisions and what we might need to do in a given instance. Okay? So I'm going to now read from C.S. Lewis's essay on chivalry. Okay, I want to thank everyone for sticking around and listening to what I have to say here. This essay, if you haven't come across this, if you haven't read this, in my opinion, is just absolute gold. And guys out there, listen to what he's saying here. There's a lot of wisdom here, a lot that you could take away from this essay, and I'm going to read from it and make a few comments throughout. And it was written in 1940, which is the early part of the Second World War. But it's called The Necessity of Chivalry. Okay? So he says, the word chivalry has meant at different times a good many different things, from heavy cavalry to giving a woman a seat in a train. But if we want to understand chivalry as an ideal, distinct from other ideals, if we want to isolate that particular conception of man, which was the special contribution of the Middle Ages to our culture, we cannot do better than turn to the words addressed to the greatest of all the imaginary knights in Malory's Morte d'Arthur. Thou wert the meekest man, says Sir Ector to the dead Lancelot. Thou wert the meekest man that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou wert the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear to the rest. The important thing about this ideal, of course, is the double demand it makes on human nature. The knight is a man of blood and iron, a man familiar with the sight of smashed faces and the ragged stumps of lopped-off limbs. He is also a demure, almost a maiden-like guest in hall, a gentle, modest, unobtrusive man. He is not a compromise or happy mean between ferocity and meekness. He is fierce to the nth and meek to the nth. When Lancelot heard himself pronounced the best knight in the world, he wept as if he had been a child that had been beaten. And the point that I want to, what I want to draw attention to here is this is not a mean, a median, an average between ferocity and softness or vulnerability. What he's saying is that you have the capacity, like I was saying earlier, you want to have that capacity to access that vulnerable side of yourself, the side of you that can let your guard down, the side of you that can feel empathy, compassion, sympathy, the side of you that can be soft and even submissive at times. You want to be able to access that side of you, to be modest, to be humble, and do that. to the nth, as C.S. Lewis says, you know, and also be able to exercise that hard side of you, the side of you that is able to be resolute and vicious and dangerous at times when the situation calls for it, the side of you that can access, in that psychological sense, that assertive energy. So it's very, very important. I'll continue on here. What, you may ask, is the relevance of this ideal to the modern world? It is terribly relevant. It may or may not be practicable. The Middle Ages notoriously failed to obey it, but it is certainly practical. Practical as the fact that that men in a desert must find water or die. Let us be quite clear that the ideal is a paradox. Most of us, having grown up among the ruins of the chivalrous tradition, were taught in our youth that a bully is always a coward. Our first week at school refuted this lie, along with its corollary, that a truly brave man is always gentle. It is a pernicious lie because it misses the real novelty and originality of the medieval demand upon human nature. Worse still, it represents, as a natural fact, something which is really a human ideal, nowhere fully attained and nowhere attained at all without arduous discipline. So a couple things there. And this is something that we seem not to, we pretend like we don't understand it or something. An ideal is something that you're moving toward. An ideal is an orientation, you know, a guiding light, you know, but it's not something that you necessarily attain. It's not an arrival point or something. And nonetheless, just because we can't fully attain it, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't aim at it. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to embody that as much as humanly possible. So the ideal here of being able to manifest both the soft side of our human nature and also the assertive side, the heroic side. And also that this is something that is acquired through discipline, okay? And ideally self-discipline. It's been said that, you know, if you can't be a master of yourself, then you'll be a slave to others. You want to, you know, develop this part of you, like chisel it out, you know, bring it out through hardship, through challenge, through suffering even, that you learn to be in this way. And this is something that you acquire, that you develop through hard work, through discipline. Carrying on. It is refuted by history and experience. Homer's Achilles knows nothing of the demand that the brave should also be the modest and the merciful. He kills men as they cry for quarter or takes them prisoner to kill them at leisure. The heroes of the sagas know nothing of it. They are as stern to inflict as they are stubborn to endure. Attila had a custom of fiercely rolling his eyes, as if he wished to enjoy the terror which he inspired. Even the Romans, when gallant enemies fell into their hands, led them through the streets for a show and cut their throats in cellars when the show was over. In the last war, we often found that the man who was invaluable in show was a man for whom in peacetime we could not easily find room except in Dartmoor. That was a famous prison, infamous prison. Such is heroism by nature, heroism outside the chivalrous tradition. Okay? So outside the chivalrous tradition, you know, heroism was, to the extent that you want to call it that, was made up of just brutes, savages, you know, people that were just prone to violence and knew nothing else. People that were just aggressive for the sake of being aggressive, dominating for the sake of dominating. And that's all that there was. And nowadays, again, like these Andrew Tate type characters, like they seem to embody that kind of thing. I don't know if this is a fair example as well, but this Sean Strickland guy, who is, I think, a UFC fighter, and I've seen more recently he's been doing these sparring matches with people who are clearly below his skill level, and he just, you know, seems to take pleasure in just beating the crap out of them. An honorable, noble man of the chivalrous tradition wouldn't do that. They would just stop. Similar to, you know, what you see a lot of nowadays is this kind of like swarming type mentality where, you know, a bunch of people, like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people, you know, will swarm one person and just kick the crap out of them. and there's no honor, there's no dignity, you know, there's just, and they feel this gleeful sense of power that they, I presume, have in doing this. They don't risk anything. They don't risk their own safety. Again, they have numbers on their side, but it's just brutality for the sake of brutality. And anyone has an ounce of that chivalrous instinct within them, like this kind of thing just sickens them. It's disgusting. It's vile. Carrying on. The medieval ideal brought together two things which have no natural tendency to gravitate towards one another. It brought them together for that very reason. It taught humility and forbearance to the great warrior because everyone knew by experience how much he usually needed that lesson. It demanded valor of the urbane and modest man because everyone knew that he was as likely as not to be a milksop, a weakling, basically. In so doing, the Middle Ages fixed on the one hope of the world. It may or may not be possible to produce, by the thousand, men who combine the two sides of Lancelot's character. But if it is not possible, then all talk of any lasting happiness or dignity in human society is pure moonshine. If we cannot produce Lancelots, humanity falls into two sections, those who can deal in blood and iron, but cannot be meek in hall, and those who are meek in hall, but useless in battle. For the third class, who are both brutal in peace and cowardly in war, need not here be discussed. Now, I will mention it as an aside that I think we are overwhelmed with those kinds of people, the kinds of people who are brutal in peace and are likely to be cowards in wartime. These are people who, you know, just they hide in their kind of social media profiles and they lash out at people and they name call and they try to ruin people's careers and do all this cowardly kind of stuff. They say things online that they wouldn't dare say to someone in person. You know, that's what these people are like. And if they were ever in an actual violent situation, they would just wet themselves, you know? We have too many of those kinds of people. Cowardly, weak, pathetic people. When this dissociation of the two halves of Lancelot occurs, history becomes a horribly simple affair. The ancient history of the Near East is like that. Hardy barbarians swarm down from their highlands and obliterate a civilization. Then they become civilized themselves and go soft. Then a new wave of barbarians comes down and obliterates them. Then the cycle begins over again. So this is rather than a linear view of history. This is a cyclical view of history, which is, I think, in many ways correct, quite frankly. Going on. Modern machinery will not change this cycle. It will only enable the same thing to happen on a larger scale, on a global scale, for example. Indeed, nothing else much can happen if the stern and the meek fall into two mutually exclusive classes. And never forget that this is their natural condition. The man who combines both characters, the knight, is a work not of nature but of art. Of that art which has human beings instead of canvas or marble for its medium. Again, this is something that we create. This is something that we develop within ourselves with the right encouragement, the right incentives, the right role models, perhaps. In the world today, there is a liberal or enlightened tradition which regards the combative side of man's nature as a pure atavistic evil and scouts the chivalrous sentiment as part of the false glamour of war. And some of you watching this video, I'm sure, like you imagine that I'm advocating violence and all the worst things of humanity and so on. That is not at all what I'm advocating here at all. And there's also a neo-heroic tradition which scouts the chivalrous sentiment as a weak sentimentality, which would raise from its grave, its shallow and unquiet grave, the pre-Christian ferocity of Achilles by a modern invocation. Going on, skipping ahead just a little bit. There is still life in the tradition which the Middle Ages inaugurated, but the maintenance of that life depends in part on knowing that the knightly character is art, not nature, something that needs to be achieved, not something that can be relied upon to happen. And this knowledge is especially necessary as we grow more democratic. In previous centuries, the vestiges of chivalry were kept alive by a specialized class. from whom they spread to other classes, partly by imitation and partly by coercion. Now it seems the people must either be chivalrous on its own resources or else choose between the two remaining alternatives of brutality and softness. This is indeed part of the general problem of a classless society, which is too seldom mentioned. I think this is a great point. A great point. Who are our role models? Who do we look up to? Who do we exalt as the embodiment of the virtues, the values that we try to emulate? I don't think we really have anyone or nothing real. We have false idols, perhaps. In some ways, I would say we're men. We're not allowed to have truly masculine heroes in our movies, in our film, in our stories. Again, a lot of this is undermined. A lot of this is tossed aside. Will its ethos be a synthesis of what was best in all the classes, or a mere pool with the sediment of all and the virtues of none? But that is too large a subject for the end of an article. My theme is chivalry. I have tried to show that this old tradition is practical and vital. The ideal embodied in Lancelot is escapism, in a sense never dreamed of by those who would use that word. It offers the only possible escape from a world divided between wolves who do not understand and sheep who cannot defend, the things which make life desirable. There was, to be sure, a rumor in the last century that wolves would gradually become extinct by some natural process, but this seems to have been an exaggeration. That's the end. So I hope that you found that insightful. I think even if you don't agree with everything that's in here, I think there's a lot to think about, a lot to chew on. One thing I will say is that, when he talks about the cycles of history and the barbarians that come down from on high, you don't have to think about actual barbarians or hardened peoples of different cultures that will overpower a weaker culture and so on. There is that, perhaps. But just think about, if we don't have a resoluteness, if we don't have a will to fight, for that which is worth fighting for, if we're not really willing to risk anything, if we're just too compliant, too soft, too obedient, it makes us susceptible to, not just like barbarians, like people who are stronger physically, but people who are more of the Machiavellian sort, people who, would develop, let's say, a totalitarian state, people who would, turn you into the bug man. Think of 1984. Think of, the lessons in Orwell's book. These are the kinds of things that I think about. And again, I'm making a case for a form of masculinity that is closer to that chivalrous tradition, embodying and practicing, engaging with that vulnerable side of your way of being, but not losing the hard side, the assertive energy, the will to stand firm for what you believe in, what is important, and to do that with honor. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for today. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for listening to the video. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe, give the video a like if you liked it, and pass along to people that you think might want to hear it. Okay, thank you.